What happens when one of Hollywood's biggest legends walks into the lion's den of late-night liberal media and refuses to play by their rules? What unfolds is nothing short of spectacular. A masterclass in speaking truth to power that left Jimmy Kimmel scrambling, the audience roaring with unexpected approval, and millions of viewers witnessing the most shocking moment in late-night television history. Arnold Schwarzenegger came to Jimmy Kimmel Live, expecting the usual softball interview about his latest projects. What he delivered instead was a brutal, uncompromising takedown of California's failed leadership, a passionate defense of American greatness, and a comprehensive dismantling of the illegal immigration crisis that has been tearing the nation apart. And he did it all on Jimmy Kimmel's home turf, in a studio located on Hollywood Boulevard, mere miles from the chaos and destruction that California's policies have created. This wasn't just an interview, this was a political earthquake. And Jimmy Kimmel, the self-appointed voice of Hollywood liberalism, could do nothing but watch helplessly as his guest systematically destroyed every talking point, every excuse, and every defense of the policies that have turned California into a cautionary tale. By the time Arnold Schwarzenegger finished speaking, the audience, Kimmel's own audience, carefully selected for their progressive politics, was giving standing ovations to ideas they had been told to reject. That's how powerful truth is when spoken with conviction. That's how compelling common sense becomes when delivered without apology. What you're about to read is the story of how Arnold Schwarzenegger walked into enemy territory and emerged victorious, leaving Jimmy Kimmel humiliated and California's political establishment exposed. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Hollywood Boulevard as Arnold Schwarzenegger's motorcade pulled up to the El Capitan Entertainment Center, home of Jimmy Kimmel Live. The iconic Austrian oak stepped out of the vehicle with his characteristic confidence, his imposing 6'2" frame still commanding attention despite being in his 70s. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit that spoke to both his Hollywood status and his political experience as California's former governor. Security personnel greeted him warmly. Production assistants buzzed around with clipboards and headsets, ensuring every detail was perfect for their A-list guest. Arnold moved through the backstage area with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, exchanging pleasantries with crew members, shaking hands, offering that famous smile that had charmed audiences for over 50 years. But those who knew Arnold, really knew him, could sense something different about his demeanor that evening. There was a steel in his eyes that hadn't been there in previous appearances, a set to his jaw that suggested he hadn't come simply to promote a project or tell amusing anecdotes from his action movie days. Arnold Schwarzenegger had something to say, and he was going to say it regardless of whether Jimmy Kimmel or his audience wanted to hear it. The green room was comfortable and well-appointed, as befitting one of late-night television's premier programs. A producer came in to brief Arnold on the show's format, the topics they planned to discuss, the general flow of the conversation. Arnold nodded politely, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the California he had fallen in love with when he first arrived in 1968. He was thinking about the California he had governed from 2003 to 2011. And he was thinking about what California had become under the catastrophic leadership of Gavin Newsom. Los Angeles was literally burning, not metaphorically, not in some exaggerated political sense. The city was on fire, plagued by riots, looting, and chaos that the media was desperately trying to downplay or ignore. Gavin Newsom's approval rating had cratered to historic lows, with 50% of Californians viewing him unfavorably. The state that had once represented the American dream had become a nightmare of failed policies, sanctuary city madness, and an immigration system so broken that it threatened the very fabric of American society. And Arnold Schwarzenegger was done being quiet about it. Jimmy Kimmel's makeup team put the finishing touches on Arnold's appearance, as the show's opening monologue played on monitors throughout the backstage area. Kimmel went through his usual routine Trump jokes, Republican mockery, progressive virtue signaling, dressed up as comedy. The studio audience laughed and applauded on cue, well trained in the responses expected of them. But in just a few minutes, that same audience would be cheering for something very different. Something their host desperately didn't want them to hear. The stage lights blazed hot as Arnold Schwarzenegger made his entrance to thunderous applause. The audience rose to their feet, cheering for the legendary action star, the successful businessman, the former governor who had transcended politics to become a genuine American icon. Jimmy Kimmel greeted him warmly, all smiles and enthusiasm, the picture of late-night host cordiality. "Arnold, it's so great to have you here," Kimmel exclaimed, shaking his hand vigorously. "You look fantastic as always." "Thank you, Jimmy," Arnold replied, his accent still thick after over 50 years in America. "It's good to be here." They settled into their seats, and the interview began smoothly enough. Small talk about Arnold's latest projects, jokes about his bodybuilding days, reminiscences about his action movie career. The audience laughed appropriately. Jimmy delivered his lines with practiced timing, and everything seemed to be following the standard late-night television script. But Jimmy Kimmel, like so many in the liberal media establishment, had made a critical miscalculation. He assumed that because Arnold had sometimes criticized Donald Trump, because he had positioned himself as a moderate Republican, because he had Hollywood connections and friends on both sides of the political aisle, that Arnold would play along with the standard progressive narratives about immigration, about Trump's policies, about California's success under Democratic leadership. He could not have been more wrong. The shift came suddenly, like a storm rolling in from the Pacific. Jimmy, perhaps emboldened by Arnold's friendly demeanor, decided to venture into political territory. His tone changed subtly, taking on that particular quality of moral superiority that late-night hosts adopt when they want to signal to their audience that they're about to say something important and progressive. "Arnold, I have to ask you," Jimmy began, leaning forward with theatrical concern. "You're someone who is trusted on both sides, which is very rare nowadays. And I think probably Donald Trump doesn't want you to be trusted, because I don't think Donald Trump likes you very much, to be honest." Arnold nodded, unfazed by the attempt to position him against Trump. "True, yeah." Jimmy pressed on, clearly thinking he had Arnold where he wanted him. "So, I think the nature of the media is to show where, there's some guys robbing and looting a medical marijuana store, and then there's a few buildings on fire, and to put that together in a montage and make it seem like all hell is breaking loose here. What is your opinion? Is that the case here in Los Angeles right now?" It was a softball question, designed to elicit the expected response. "Oh no, Jimmy, it's all exaggerated. Los Angeles is fine. The media is making it worse than it is. Everything's great under Democratic leadership." But Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't give the expected response. "No," Arnold said simply, his voice carrying unexpected weight. Then he paused, and the pause stretched long enough that Jimmy shifted slightly in his seat. When Arnold continued, his tone had changed completely from friendly guest to former governor who had seen enough nonsense. "Well, first of all, let's just be honest. The whole thing has to do with the deportation." Jimmy blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "Yes, of course," he said weakly, trying to maintain control of the conversation. "Of course, this is a very sensitive subject to me," Arnold continued, his voice steady but gaining intensity, "because when I came over to this country, I was living in fear of being deported." Jimmy's face lit up, thinking Arnold was about to deliver an emotional defense of illegal immigrants. "Were you?" "Yeah," Arnold replied, and then delivered his first devastating blow disguised as humor. "Because at one point, I did a movie that was so bad that I thought the critics would deport me and send me back to Austria." The audience erupted in laughter. Jimmy laughed too, relieved that they were back in safe comedic territory. But those who were paying close attention noticed that Arnold's expression remained serious beneath the joke. He was setting something up, laying groundwork, preparing to shift the conversation in a direction Jimmy desperately wouldn't want it to go. "You were worried that you were going to be deported for creative reasons," Jimmy joked, trying to keep things light. "Yes," Arnold said, allowing the laughter to die down naturally. "But seriously, of course, there truly are families that are worried they're going to be deported." Jimmy saw his opening, the chance to steer Arnold into a sympathetic defense of illegal immigration that would make Trump look heartless. "Do you think that people who have been in this country for 25 years and who have had no criminal activity whatsoever should be granted the rights of U.S. citizenship?" It was the perfect setup for a progressive answer. For a declaration that, of course, people who had been here for decades should get amnesty, should get citizenship, should be rewarded for successfully breaking the law long enough. But Arnold Schwarzenegger had other plans. "This is what I'm talking about, immigration reform," Arnold said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone who had actually governed, who had actually dealt with these issues from a position of responsibility rather than celebrity virtue signaling. A comprehensive immigration reform will address all of those issues. Yes, Jimmy nodded enthusiastically, thinking Arnold was agreeing with the progressive position, but Arnold wasn't done, not even close. And also we would then be able to hand out more visas, temporary working permits, permanent working permits, the green card, and citizenship, all of those things, Arnold continued, his voice growing stronger, more emphatic. And we would know who comes into the United States rather than not knowing and having so many people here that we don't even know who they are and what kind of criminal activities they're participating in and all this. The audience fell silent. This wasn't the answer they had been expecting. This wasn't the progressive narrative they had been trained to applaud. Arnold had just said on Jimmy Kimmel Live, in the heart of liberal Hollywood, that the current immigration system was allowing criminals into the country unchecked. Jimmy's smile flickered slightly, but Arnold was just getting started. So it's a shame, the whole thing, Arnold said, his accent thickening slightly with passion, because we have a country that needs workers, and when you look south of the border, they want to work. So it's a perfect match. But let's do it legally and let's do it in a coherent way, rather than doing it the way it is right now, which is a disaster. The word disaster echoed through the studio. Arnold Schwarzenegger had just called the Biden administration's immigration policy, the policy Jimmy Kimmel defended nightly in his monologues, a disaster, on Jimmy's own show, to Jimmy's own audience. And then Arnold delivered the knockout punch. And I told you, that's what makes me so disappointed that both of the parties do not want to go and solve this problem once and for all, and create good immigration reform the way, like Senator Kennedy and John McCain worked it out. They had a really great bill there, but then they didn't go for it. Jimmy tried to jump in, tried to salvage the narrative, but Arnold had seized complete control of the conversation. The audience sat transfixed, many of them nodding along despite themselves, because what Arnold was saying made sense. Perfect, logical, common sense. The kind of sense that gets drowned out in partisan screaming matches, but resonates immediately when spoken clearly and without apology. We want immigrants. We need immigrants. But they need to come legally. We need to know who they are. We need to ensure they're not criminals. We need a system that works rather than the chaos we have now. It was so simple, so obvious, so devastatingly effective at cutting through the fog of progressive talking points that Jimmy Kimmel built his show around. Jimmy shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with where this conversation had gone. He had invited Arnold on expecting either neutral promotion of his projects or perhaps some mild criticism of Trump that would allow Jimmy to pile on with his usual mockery. Instead, Arnold had just delivered a comprehensive defense of legal immigration and border security that made Trump's policies sound perfectly reasonable. But Jimmy Kimmel wasn't ready to surrender his show to common sense. Not yet. He decided to pivot, to attack from a different angle, to try to paint Trump as the villain, regardless of what Arnold was saying about immigration policy. It seems like our president doesn't want to have this problem solved, Jimmy said, his voice taking on that whiny, accusatory tone that has become the signature of liberal late-night hosts. He wants to create problems here in our country. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Jimmy had just accused the president of deliberately creating chaos, of wanting America to fail, of being motivated by malice rather than policy disagreement. It was the kind of over-the-top attack that usually plays well with progressive audiences, that gets applause and cheers and social media engagement. But Arnold Schwarzenegger wasn't having it. I have to tell you, Arnold began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived through real crises, who had perspective that transcended partisan politics. People always say to me, "Oh my God, what's going on in America right now?" And all this stuff. He paused, letting the moment build, and when he continued, his voice was filled with conviction that made Jimmy's cynicism sound hollow by comparison. And I said to them, "Relax." That single word, relax, delivered with Arnold's accent and absolute confidence, seemed to deflate Jimmy's entire premise. The audience leaned forward, sensing something significant was about to be said. "I came over here in 1968, where it was a disaster," Arnold continued, his voice rising with passionate intensity. "Even though it was the most fantastic country. But I came over here in 1968. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. There were riots left and right because of the Vietnam War. There were protests. Then there was the attack on the Democratic Convention in Chicago, and then after that there was Watergate, and the thing went on and on and on where people said, "What is going on in America?" The studio was completely silent now. Arnold was painting a picture of chaos far worse than anything happening today, putting current events in historical perspective that completely undermined the progressive narrative that America was facing unprecedented crisis under Trump. "And we got out of that mess," Arnold declared, his voice booming with confidence. "So America will always get out of this mess. When we will get out of this, believe me, this will be solved, this issue." Jimmy tried to interject, to steer back toward criticism of Trump, but Arnold rolled right over him. "Los Angeles will always be a great city to come to. I'm very, very proud of Los Angeles." His voice softened slightly, filled with genuine love for the city and state he had called home for over 50 years. "And I think the key thing here is that the federal government and the state and the locals work together to solve those problems." The audience erupted in applause. Not the polite applause of people clapping because they're supposed to, but genuine, enthusiastic applause from people who were starving for this kind of optimistic, solutions-oriented perspective. Jimmy looked shocked by the response, clearly not expecting his progressive Los Angeles audience to cheer for a message of cooperation and American resilience. But Arnold Schwarzenegger still wasn't done. He had one more bomb to drop, one more truth to speak that would leave Jimmy Kimmel completely speechless. Jimmy tried desperately to regain control, to inject some positivity into what had become a complete dismantling of his worldview. "People need to hear that," he said quickly, "because people are looking for something positive. I think a lot of people are feeling disheartened and like, oh, things are not going to get better, they're going to get worse." Arnold nodded, and then delivered the single most powerful moment of the entire interview. "Let me tell everyone here," he began, his voice filled with emotion and absolute conviction. "I travel a lot, and I just came back from Europe." He paused, making eye contact with audience members, with the cameras, with Jimmy himself. And to this day, as much as 50 years ago, the same amount of people come up to me and say, "Arnold, please, can you help me to get to America?" The audience gasped audibly. This was not the narrative they had been fed for years. They had been told America was a racist, oppressive, failing nation that everyone wanted to escape. They had been told that Trump had destroyed America's standing in the world, that nobody wanted to come here anymore, that we were an international embarrassment. But Arnold Schwarzenegger, who actually traveled the world, who actually talked to real people in other countries, was telling them something completely different. "They do," Arnold continued, his voice rising with passionate intensity, "because it's the greatest country in the world." The audience erupted. Not scattered applause, but thunderous, sustained applause. People were standing now, cheering, clapping, some with tears in their eyes. Jimmy Kimmel sat frozen in his chair, his face a mask of stunned confusion. This was his audience, his carefully cultivated, properly progressive audience giving a standing ovation to a declaration of American greatness. Arnold wasn't done. "It is the best country in the world," he declared, his voice booming through the studio. "It is fantastic. No matter who is leading it and all this stuff, people come and go, but this will always be the greatest country." The applause grew louder. The energy in the studio had completely transformed. What had started as a typical liberal late-night show had become something else entirely, a genuine celebration of American exceptionalism in the heart of Hollywood. "And this is why I cannot wait to celebrate the 250th anniversary of America," Arnold continued, his voice thick with emotion now, "and to just, once again, say thank you, America, for bringing me into this country and showing me this enormous generosity. Everything that I've ever accomplished in my life is because of it." The ovation was deafening now. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the bodybuilder from Austria who could barely speak English when he arrived, had just delivered the most powerful defense of American greatness ever heard on late-night television. And he had done it on Jimmy Kimmel's show, to Jimmy Kimmel's audience, completely destroying every cynical anti-American narrative that show had been built upon. Jimmy sat there, his mouth slightly open, clearly struggling to process what had just happened. His show had been hijacked. His audience had been converted. His narrative had been obliterated, and there was nothing he could do about it. But Arnold had saved one final strike for California's failed political leadership, one last truth bomb that would ensure this interview went down as legendary. Earlier in the conversation, Jimmy had tried to paint Trump as an unreasonable tyrant for threatening to withhold federal funding from California. He had positioned Governor Gavin Newsom as a brave resistance fighter, standing up to federal overreach. It was the standard progressive framing: California good, Trump bad. But Arnold had systematically demolished that narrative with a single, devastating observation. When Jimmy had rambled about Trump threatening funding and asked Arnold's opinion on Newsom's idea to stop paying federal taxes, Arnold had delivered a response that cut through all the political posturing. "Well, it sounds always easy, isn't it?" Arnold had said, his voice dripping with the kind of world-weary wisdom that comes from actually having governed rather than just talking about it. "It sounds easy, but this doesn't happen because every individual in California pays taxes, pays the state tax, local tax, and pays federal tax. So how are you going to stop them from doing that? And then if the IRS is coming after you, look." He had paused, letting the impossibility of Newsom's grandstanding sink in. "I just want everyone to know, this is all dialogue. This is rhetoric. The left going after the right going after the left. The bottom line is they should get together rather than always pointing the finger at each other. They should really get together and solve this problem, because that's what the American people want. They want to have this problem solved." It was a masterclass in cutting through political theater. Arnold had just exposed both Newsom's empty threats and the media's complicity in amplifying meaningless political posturing over actual problem solving. And he had done it so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that it was impossible to argue with. But the most devastating blow to California's political establishment came earlier, when Jimmy had tried to downplay the riots and chaos in Los Angeles by suggesting the media was exaggerating the situation. Arnold's response had been swift and brutal. "Not all of Los Angeles is a war zone," he had acknowledged, giving Jimmy a momentary hope that he would defend the status quo. But this wouldn't happen if the politicians would do the work. The statement landed like a bomb. Arnold Schwarzenegger, former Republican governor of California, Hollywood legend, beloved figure to millions, had just publicly blamed California's Democratic leadership for the riots, the fires, the chaos consuming Los Angeles. "Think about it," he had added, letting the indictment sink in. And the audience had cheered. Jimmy Kimmel's own audience, in his own studio, on Hollywood Boulevard, had cheered for a direct attack on Democratic governance in California. Gavin Newsom's 50% unfavorability rating suddenly made perfect sense. Even in deep blue California, even in the heart of liberal Los Angeles, people were waking up to the reality that their leaders had failed them. And Arnold Schwarzenegger had just given them permission to acknowledge that reality, to speak that truth, to demand better. Jimmy Kimmel tried several times throughout the interview to steer the conversation back toward Trump criticism, toward progressive talking points, toward anything that would salvage the narrative he had built his show around. Each time, Arnold either ignored the attempt or redirected toward common-sense solutions that made Trump's policies sound perfectly reasonable. When Jimmy tried to make Trump sound like a dictator for immigration enforcement, Arnold responded by explaining why comprehensive immigration reform required knowing who was in the country. When Jimmy tried to paint America as broken and failing, Arnold responded with a stirring defense of American exceptionalism that brought the audience to its feet. When Jimmy tried to defend California's Democratic leadership, Arnold calmly explained that the problems were directly attributable to politicians not doing their jobs. It was a systematic destruction of every pillar of the progressive narrative, delivered with such good humor and friendly demeanor that Jimmy couldn't even get angry about it without looking petty and defensive. As the interview wound down and Arnold prepared to leave the stage, the audience gave him a final standing ovation. Jimmy Kimmel forced a smile, shook Arnold's hand, and thanked him for coming on the show. But everyone in that studio, everyone watching at home, knew what had just happened. Arnold Schwarzenegger had walked into the heart of liberal Hollywood and delivered an uncompromising defense of legal immigration, American greatness, and common-sense governance. He had exposed California's leadership as failed and ineffective. He had given voice to the millions of Americans who are tired of political theater and desperate for actual solutions. And he had done it all with such charm, such confidence, such unshakable conviction that even Jimmy Kimmel's carefully curated progressive audience couldn't help but applaud. The clip went viral within hours. Conservative media outlets played it on repeat, marveling at Arnold's courage in speaking truth to power. Liberal commentators tried desperately to spin it, to suggest Arnold had been taken out of context or didn't really mean what he clearly meant. But the video didn't lie. The audience reaction didn't lie. Arnold Schwarzenegger had just delivered one of the most powerful political moments in late-night television history, and he had done it by simply refusing to lie. By refusing to pretend California's policies were working. By refusing to pretend illegal immigration wasn't a crisis. By refusing to pretend America wasn't still the greatest nation on earth. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Jimmy Kimmel, born in America, raised in comfort, made wealthy by American opportunity, spent his show mocking America, criticizing America, suggesting America was broken and failing. Arnold Schwarzenegger, who grew up in post-war Austria, who arrived in America with nothing, who built an extraordinary life through hard work and determination, spent his appearance celebrating America, defending America, declaring America the greatest country in the world. Which perspective resonated more? The audience answered that question definitively with their standing ovation. What made Arnold's appearance even more remarkable was the timing. This interview happened while Los Angeles was literally burning, while Gavin Newsom's approval rating had cratered to historic lows, while the consequences of failed progressive policies were visible on every street corner in California's major cities. Arnold wasn't speaking in hypotheticals or abstractions. He was speaking about real failures, real consequences, real people suffering under real bad governance. And unlike so many celebrities who carefully hedge their statements and qualify their opinions to avoid backlash, Arnold spoke with absolute conviction. When he said America was the greatest country in the world, he meant it. When he said California's problems were caused by politicians not doing their work, he meant it. When he said we need to know who's coming into our country, he meant it. That authenticity, that refusal to play the political games that define modern celebrity discourse, was what made his appearance so powerful and so viral. People are starving for public figures who will speak truth plainly, who will call out failures honestly, who will celebrate American greatness unapologetically. Arnold Schwarzenegger gave them exactly that. And in doing so, he reminded everyone why he remains one of America's most beloved figures, despite decades in the public eye, despite political controversies, despite coming from the opposing party of most of Hollywood. A loves America. Not the abstract idea of America that politicians invoke when convenient, but the real America that gave a poor Austrian bodybuilder the opportunity to become a movie star, a millionaire, and a governor. The America that still, to this day, draws people from around the world who want a chance at the American dream. As Arnold walked off the stage to sustained applause, Jimmy Kimmel sat in his chair, his usual smug confidence replaced by visible discomfort. His show, his carefully constructed platform for progressive messaging, had just been used to deliver one of the most powerful conservative messages in late-night television history. The irony was delicious, the justice was poetic, and the impact will be lasting. California's political establishment had been exposed. The immigration crisis had been named honestly. American greatness had been celebrated without apology. And millions of people had witnessed a masterclass in how to speak truth to power, with grace, humor, and unshakable conviction. Did Jimmy Kimmel invite Arnold on his show expecting this outcome? Absolutely not. Did Arnold plan to deliver such a comprehensive dismantling of progressive narratives? Perhaps not explicitly. But when given the platform, when asked the questions, Arnold did what he has always done, spoke his truth plainly, and let the chips fall where they may. And those chips fell hard on Jimmy Kimmel's head, on Gavin Newsom's failed governorship, and on every cynical progressive who has spent years telling Americans that their country isn't special, that borders don't matter, that chaos is normal, and that anyone who disagrees is a bigot. Arnold Schwarzenegger proved them all wrong in less than 20 minutes. And he made it look easy. The question isn't whether Arnold was right. The audience's reaction answered that definitively. The question is whether more public figures will find the courage to speak with similar honesty, whether more celebrities will risk backlash to defend common sense, whether more Americans will demand that their leaders actually solve problems, rather than just posture about them. If Arnold's appearance on Jimmy Kimmel Live sparked that kind of awakening, then it will have been worth far more than just a viral moment. It will have been the beginning of a real shift in how we talk about immigration, governance, and American greatness. And Jimmy Kimmel? He learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the power of simple truth delivered with conviction. Because no amount of cleverness, no amount of snark, no amount of progressive posturing can compete with someone who genuinely loves America and isn't afraid to say so. Arnold Schwarzenegger said so. And America heard him loud and clear.